The French Revolution, perhaps one of the most misunderstood and generalized events in Western history. To us Americans, we're often taught that it was but a counterpart to our own revolution, a glorious liberating of a people from under the boot of a distant and disconnected tyrant. But the causes and players of the revolution are not quite what we've made them out to be. Moreover, observation would cite that the revolutionaries had either failed to achieve their goal, or simply never stopped achieving their goal, as the French Revolution would only be the first of a few which seemed to follow a common pattern of destabilizing the current order, establishing an increasingly liberal republic, and later foregoing the republic to give extreme authority to a leader who represented the now status quo. I've discussed this in my original video of if the revolution never happened, but the primary motive for it was to enact increased liberalism. Generation after generation seemingly demanding greater equality, more social services, and so on. Kings and emperors were tolerated so long as they delivered on egalitarian policy and provided more for the public. A theory as to the cause of this trend is that following the first successful revolution, countless nobles and intellectuals were hunted down and driven from the land, or worse. France at the time also had the largest population in all of Europe, and most of that population was composed of peasants, many of whom by nature weren't notably intelligent and were dependent on the system the nobles had created to survive, despite how poor conditions may have been. The aftermath of the revolution likely led to a brain drain and a culture of dependency on strong guidance, as it would have been the only system the peasants and their children would have known. The lesser educated rely on the more intelligent for guidance after all, and that opened the door of control for men like Napoleon, who championed egalitarian policy, but were also firm leaders. Whatever the case, things were never really the same for France after the revolution, but what if the revolution never happened? Of course, the peasantry wouldn't tolerate the system forever, but what if their needs could be satiated well enough that thoughts of revolution simply don't manifest? Essentially, France would need to embrace just enough egalitarian policy to keep the peasants too comfortable to revolt. That anyone who suggested such a thing was only trying to bring hardship to a good system that the peasants were content to live in. There's a common misunderstanding of Louis XVI as well, commonly believed to be a pampered and spoiled bigwig who didn't give a rat's hat about his own people. But the contrary is actually the truth. Louis was fanatic about the Enlightenment and an early practitioner who very much wanted to liberate the peasants from their serfdom and indebtedness to the nobles, to grant them a fairer hand in politics, to draw up a personal bill of rights for the lower class, abolish the death penalty, which he believed inhumane, and overall alleviate the burdens beset upon the poor. The reason you've probably never heard of this is because these so-called progressives who took charge weren't truly the voice of the people, but a new class of elites who took advantage of the peasant outrage to eliminate their opposition during the Reign of Terror. It's actually quite interesting the more you reflect on the contributing factors and the effects of the French Revolution, how much of a similarity you find between it and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. There were anti-religious elements which arose, a purging of the aristocracy, a seizing and redistributing of wealth, and a council-based system which was ultimately replaced by a dictatorial ruler. Because history is of course told by those who win, we've only gotten one side of the story, and frankly been misled as to the more nefarious actions of the French revolutionaries, though that's not to say all had sinister intent. In actuality, it was but a few small but highly influential men and groups, such as the Hébertistes and the Sans-Culottes. The peasants for the most part were useful fools who were used as tools of destruction to bring down the current establishment. Now you might ask, well, why didn't King Louis enact any of his policies, since it seems they would have saved him a world of trouble? Well, the fact is that he didn't have the power. That's right, despite being an absolute monarch, the power of the king was near useless in France without the okay of the aristocracy and the clergy. The old regime of France was perhaps best described as a theocratic oligarchy, as the church and nobles held real power, while the king was but a face to represent both. And the nobles did halt Louis at every attempt he made until eventually he lost faith in real change and stopped trying. But what if things went differently? What if King Louis was more outspoken and assertive about his beliefs, and in doing so reaches the ears of Enlightenment idealists, would-be revolutionaries, and the downtrodden subjects of his kingdom, allowing him to raise from the people a king's guard, to reclaim authority from the nobles, to re-establish himself as an enlightened monarch? People were certainly willing to fight for a better life in France, and the peasants generally didn't outright hate the king. To most he was still holy, a divinely selected leader. Had he as king engaged more directly with his people and shown his sympathy, he well could have taken the reins of his country back for the better. Using his newly found power, Louis would abolish taxes which burdened and targeted the peasants, allowing them to retain more wealth and gradually improve their qualities of life. Prisons are reformed to have more humane conditions, and the death penalty becomes a thing of the past, meaning no guillotine either. The most anti-reformist of the nobles would see imprisonment for treason against the king, while the rest were kept loyal through a show of strength by the people. a number of public humanities are established, such as schoolhouses and medical centers open to all. But eventually progress would need to slow. France at the time was saddled with a heavy debt from its role in the American Revolution. Wealth allocated from the funds of the nobles subsidized recent improvements, but that would eventually run out. However, with the peasants satiated and fully behind Louis, he would now have the time necessary to dig France out of its financial hole. Immediately, the US is turned to as an obvious source of income. The newly formed nation would need allies and trade partners, so France assumed it could take the young nation under its wing as an imperial big brother. In our timeline, the US rightfully refused to involve itself in the French Revolution, and at the time had a non-interventionist policy so far as military action went. But Louis may be able to bargain an exclusive trade partnership between itself and the US, sweetening the deal by offering the Louisiana Territory as their first exchange at a greatly reduced cost. The land was going largely unused and drew resources away from domestic needs, so much like Napoleon did, Louis would trade it away for some much-needed cash, and this time around a new trade partnership. France would also build an alliance with fellow Bourbon Kingdom Spain for the sake of mutual defense. A dwindling economy meant reductions to the French army. A not-so-bad trade-off since, as I previously mentioned, France had the largest population in all of Europe at the time, meaning a deep pool of reserves to draw upon, although not necessarily the best trained or best armed. This could be improved if basic training was made part of the curriculum or even the cost of enrolling in a public school, to essentially make of the massive peasant population a citizenry of soldiers. Because in this timeline Napoleon never rises to power and invades Spain, the kingdom remains stable and is able to become wealthier and more industrious than it had been in our world, opening the possibility of even more trade opportunity for France. France's relationships would be fairly complementary. Louis, as an enlightened monarch, is able to be the bridge between monarchist Spain and enlightened America. And while united for the sake of mutual benefit, they also shared a common disdain for Britain. France and Britain were of course rivals, Britain basically destroyed Spain's empire, and the US still recognized Britain as that tyrannical force across the pond. But Britain had its own allied powers which stood in solid parallel to those of France. In America stood British Canada, and Iberia was Britain's long-standing ally of Portugal, and Britain itself being right across the channel from France. The French would be in a recovery process, but not yet ready to combat Britain should tensions arise, and so Spain alone would not do. France sought out yet another ally in a pact of defense against Britain. That ally would be Austria, not the most reliable of comrades, but still a force to be reckoned with. This period of history could have very easily become a powder keg if things had unfolded the way we've described. However, the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars swiftly diffused it as the European coalitions came together against France instead of each other. Austria and Prussia were on the brink of conflict over territorial disputes, with Britain likely to support Prussia. Spain was making considerations to exert further dominance over Portugal, and Britain, after harassing US ships, was facing what would become the War of 1812. It's not clear what France would have done this time around in Napoleon's absence, though in our world Louis had hoped to originally use the American Revolution to expel Britain from India. Had conflicts arisen between the US and Britain in Napoleon's absence, this might offer a second chance to conquer the region for itself. If we allow things to move as they have been, we could see a division or dispute within the Holy Roman Empire trigger an annexation of lands by Prussia, or an invasion of the empire which would in turn force Austria to mobilize in defense of the Germanic territories. All the while Britain is pulled into the conflict by Prussia. Conflicts could also be initiated by British impressment of American soldiers and the harassing of US ships, triggering the US to invade Canada in retaliation. Spain could also attempt to seize back Almeida, which it had occupied during the 1762 invasion of Portugal, bringing Britain to support Portugal as it had in the past. Regardless of where the conflict starts, France's response to each would pull the others into the conflict. France backs Spain's invasion and attempts to halt the British Navy from reaching Portugal. Meanwhile, a land invasion of the Holy Roman Empire is launched to expel Prussia. The war in America draws away British resources from the European front, and France, hoping to compound the problem, supports some faction within India into a rebellion against Britain. There was a possibility for most of these conflicts to have happened during the American Revolution, however France abstained from direct conflict as it wasn't by this point very confident in its own capabilities and feared a repeat of the 7 Years' War. This time around, France believes it has a chance. The Kingdom of France would still retain General Napoleon as a military asset, and put him to use in Germania before circling him back to fight the campaign in Iberia. Of course, France's military and political leadership is fairly different in this world, however that's not necessarily a bad thing, as it means a good deal of the old generals and tacticians would have survived the conflict and been able to pair their capabilities with those of Napoleon, who would no doubt still ascend to a high military rank. Having defeated most of Europe single-handedly in our timeline, there's little doubt that Napoleon, now with the immediate support of Austria and Spain, wouldn't be able to grasp a landslide victory. The British Navy still breaks the French blockade and pairs a naval bombardment with a land push to drive Spain out of Portugal, But Napoleon manages to push back and occupy a large segment of northern Portugal. A stalemate is called, and border cities are annexed by Spain, but Portugal retains most of its occupied land. Austria comes out victorious and reassumes Germanic dominance, assuring that it become the power to unite Germany instead of Prussia in this world. The overseas wars ran into a stalemate type of situation as well. Though the conflicts had favored Britain, the peace treaty would require the liberation of Quebec as well as the coastal Indian lands from British rule. This victory would trigger in France, as had been seen in the US, an era of good feelings, marked by both economic and territorial growth, the new French Empire potentially expanding further into the Italian or Germanic states post-war, and maybe even establishing a Bourbon Union with Spain under a shared monarch. The US goes about its typical path with much more liberty and expanding northward now that British Canada had been weakened along with the British domain in the Americas overall, perhaps later forming the basis for a Spanish-American type war with Britain to expel them from Canada and the Caribbean. The British Empire's time in the sun was over. The spotlight had been taken by France and its allies. The European paradigm had shifted again in a victory for both Enlightenment ideals and the culture of Catholicism. In our world during Napoleon's campaigns, there were talks between France and Russia, peaceful talks. Russia didn't always fear the French Emperor Napoleon, at one point seeing him as a potential ally for a grand plan to conquer India and divide the land mutually between their domains. But peaceful discussions vanished as it became apparent Napoleon had all of Europe in his sights. In this world, that fear never manifests, and the French campaign to drive Britain out of India is followed by a dual invasion of the land, securing a highly prized asset for the empires, which in the coming years would bring them a wealth that had fueled Britain's colonial endeavors for over a century in our world. This special relationship which would develop between France's allies would open the door for deeper Russo-American relations. In our world, the two had actually been rather close up until the Napoleonic War, then picking up again, but cutting things off entirely following the rise of the USSR. In our timeline, Russia did very little with Alaska, but in this world, with the additional resources and wealth brought in from India, as well as greater access to Canadian lands on the side of the US, Alaska may well be developed into a hub for Russo-American trade and resource extraction, perhaps leading to a gold rush, in turn leading to a mass populating of the region. Britain, in lieu of India, may set its sights on colonizing China, Indochina, and Indonesia, probably meaning more opium wars and a greater dominance over the Chinese coast. France, later down the line, would lend support to the US during the Mexican-American War, and in the wake of it lay claim to the remaining Mexican land unclaimed by the US. If the Bourbon Union is established, Spain could justify this as a reconquest of a lost colony, and install a member of the Spanish line to rule more strictly, or if not, France could just as easily install someone else. The American Civil War would prove to be an even greater loss for the Confederacy, as the Union would maintain an alliance with its pro-Enlightenment allies. However, the South could very well stir up a rebellion in Mexico to keep France distracted. Austria, whenever its collapse comes, will retain its Germanic lands and may unite with Prussia to establish a greater Germany. Domestically, France took a gamble making the alliances it did following such a major political change, and while this war could have just as easily broken France, the nation emerged reborn with a non-hereditary enlightened monarch system, which in time would create a new nobility class out of the families of former kings to carry on France's progressive transition as much as becomes necessary. This might eventually backfire if it goes too far for, say, the nobles or even peasants, and ignite a counter-enlightenment movement to restore more traditional roles. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z, thanks for watching. Support your Legion by liking the video, check out our website usofz.com, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.